I'll get in quick before they start recording. Oh no, they are. Well, good morning all. I want to read today from Hebrews chapter 12. And all that we've sung, especially the last hymn that we sung, and some of the prayers have been a great introduction to what we're going to look at today. Hebrews 12, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So I've been thinking quite a lot about this just recently. I was involved in or attending another funeral this week on Monday. Somebody that grew up with us in youth. There were just three of us lads in the youth or Bible class in our church. And so being involved in that this Monday just makes you think again, as it has with other funerals recently, about our race, about where we're headed to. And recently we had Neil. He showed us, was it last Sunday or perhaps the Sunday before? There was the image that he showed us of Alan Wells at the start of the race. And I don't know if you remember seeing that, but it was a sort of side-on view with Alan Wells leaning forward. You could see every sinew in his neck as he was leaning forward, just waiting for the starter's gun to go to race off. And that's quite an inspiring photo. But one thing to bear in mind is that that was Alan Wells at the start of a 100-meter race. And it's important to start well. It's important to get going. And sometimes, I mean, I think probably a factor for our lives as we start the Christian race is that we start like that, raring to go, wanting to get cracking. But I want to consider this morning something a bit more of the longer game, as it were, because we don't want to fall away. And if we start like that, then that's all great and that's good. But if we were to try to carry on like that for the rest of our lives, I think we'll find out that we're like those people that do a 100-meter race are afterwards, or at least those that do one that's a bit longer. You see them flat out on the floor, panting for breath, and they can't go any further. And so I want to just consider this morning from these verses that we've looked at, how we prepare ourselves and how we keep going through the race that we've got. And that the emphasis seems to be on perseverance rather than speed. The emphasis seems to be on making sure that we finish well, not just starting. And also the emphasis is on finishing, not particularly on winning. And so many of our pictures of races that we have in this life are all about winning. But the Bible doesn't really talk much about winning. In fact, I don't know, perhaps somebody can think of one, but I can't think of one. It keeps on talking about making sure that we finish. And in this passage that we read, it talks about the great cloud of witnesses. And that makes me think, it's often these pictures that you see of the London Marathon, which sort of fill our minds when we think about things like this. As the runners are running along, especially in most normal years, then you get crowds of people each side watching them as they're carrying on. After Hebrews 11, the list of all the people, the men of faith, it comes straight into this saying that we are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses. And I was just wondering actually a little bit, who are these cloud of witnesses? It's easy initially to just think of it as people watching, and a certain amount of it is, I'm sure. But I sometimes don't like it when people talk just sentimentally about, especially at funerals, oh, someone must be watching what's going on. And there's very few instances in the scriptures. There's a reappearance of Samuel and Moses and Elijah, but not many people. And I wonder if, rather than thinking of it in terms of being watched, witnessing, whether it's more that it's saying that they're testifying in witnessing. They're almost like a witness in a court of law. They're testifying to the truth of a life of faith. And so their stories are what witnesses to us and carries us on. That's pretty much what came out in Stuart Townend's song that we sang, the last verse. Oh, Spirit, come, put strength in every stride. And it talked about the witnesses testifying to grace in their lives. And that's wonderful, isn't it? That we can see in other people's lives that it was true and it took them through to the end. And I mean, the other thing in a marathon you see is not only people on the sidelines, but you see the other people taking part in the race. You see sometimes a complete crowd of people. Perhaps there might be a guy in the middle wearing a Donald Duck costume. That might be the person that's being focused on running the marathon race, but surrounded by such a great number of people. And that's an encouragement to us too. Although thinking about that, just a phrase popped into my mind. I think it was a book that was written by somebody who runs lots of marathons, and it was titled The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. And so, if you like, side by side with these images of being surrounded by lots of people encouraging us, there are times when our race, our walk, our journey can be a lonely one. And perhaps we were reminded of that last week when Les was talking about Noah. I can't think of a more lonely person really than Noah. Talked about him being perfect in his generation, but when it came to it, him and his family were the only ones that entered the ark. So there you start to get a picture of someone who was kind of the loneliest of all, but continuing to keep running, that he got into the ark and fulfilled God's purposes. Paul in Acts, he says, I consider my life worth nothing to me, if only that I might finish the race and complete the task that God has given me. So looking back into Hebrews, kind of the key bit that I want to focus on this morning is is it verse 1 or 2? In verse 1, it says, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And to start with, I just want to look at these two things. One is the things that hinder, the things that slow us down. And secondly, the sin that so easily entangles, that's the things that can trip us up. So thinking about the things that slow you down, the things that hinder you. And there's a number of things that I thought of. First of all, there's weights that we can end up carrying. things like injustices, hurts, being misunderstood. Sometimes those things just pull at us and can sometimes dominate our lives. And if we're misunderstood, we don't have to justify ourselves. We can just lay it aside, cast it aside. That's often the best way to deal with these weights. Think of blind Bartimaeus when he was going to Jesus. He cast aside his coat and just went forward. He didn't let it pull him down. Thinking about other things that hinder us, burdens that we have. And very often we encourage each other, don't we, with the verse, cast all your cares on him. All your cares. And almost every time I read that or hear it said, you get this sense that it almost seems irresponsible. But God does want us to be irresponsible. Almost like blind Bartimaeus throwing his coat aside. You could think that that could be irresponsible, but this is how God wants us to be, that we can almost seem like we're irresponsible in the way that we're casting things that are going to slow us down aside. So as well as weights, burdens, I was thinking of impediments. What impediments slow us down? Sometimes feeling that we're not as gifted as other people. That can be something that impedes us. We start to look too much at how other people are getting on and start to consider where we are with that. And just one thing to say is that in the parable about the talents, one was given 1 talent, one was given 5, another 10. And in the end, he looked at it, the one that was given 5 gained another 5 and had 10 in the end. The person that had 1, if that person had used the talent and ended up with 2, the progress, not the number, but the progress would have been the same. They'd have both doubled the amount that they'd got. And that's, I think, the important thing about our moving forwards, that it's the progress that we make. So I think a great danger to us sometimes is looking too much at other people and considering what they've done. The third thing that's pretty much talked about actually in verse 3 of Hebrews 12 is about losing heart. And that can be something else that can slow us down, that as we're moving along, it can sometimes seem that we're not moving along, if you know what I mean. Sometimes seem that it's just kind of been the same, and we're wondering where we're getting to. And so we do sometimes have to encourage ourselves and to remind ourselves of these scriptures, that if they're telling us not to lose heart, then there's the possibility of losing heart. Sometimes just simply to know that there's that possibility is important to us, because we can recognize it and then come to find the answer. As it says in Hebrews 12:3, consider him who endured such opposition. That was what could have caused Jesus to lose heart. But although he had such opposition from sinful men, he says, continue, so you will not grow weary. And in verse 5, he says, have you forgotten the word of encouragement that addresses you as sons? My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you. And so another way in which we can lose heart is we've been making progress, going ahead, and then we find the Lord disciplines us. And we think, that might almost seem a bit unfair. We were doing the best that we could, or trying to move forward. And then the answer, the reason it gives us is that it's because we're sons, and the Lord wants to discipline us, to train us, to make us better. And just seeing on my screen, Andy Sulam and everybody there, Ivy, just hello again. That's what you want, isn't it, for your children? You don't want to discourage them when you discipline them. Whenever you discipline them, it's to try and help them to do what they should be doing and to be making good progress. So let's receive it when the Lord disciplines us. Look, let's not feel discouraged. Let's be encouraged. And then lastly, Graham spoke in one of his morning things fairly recently about Asa. And if you remember, it was titled about watching out for the problem of ease. And he talked about Asa early in his life, trusted God for deliverance. But through the ease of a number of years going ahead, later on, when troubles came again, he didn't look to God, and he looked to his own resources, looked to his own thoughts and abilities for how to deal with it. And so another potential problem for us as we press forward is times of ease, which can end up causing us to get our perspective, get our understanding wrong. So my first question on this part of it is, what hinders you? Each of us run our own race. Each of us have got different things which affect us. What is it that slows you down? And just think about that and let the Lord help you. If it's casting something off, then cast it off. If it's letting go of an injustice or being misunderstood, lay that aside so that it doesn't hinder you anymore. If it's that we're at ease, then don't let that dictate to us, but let's keep our eyes where they should be and let's keep going forwards. So let's throw off everything that hinders, but also then it goes on to say, and the sin that so easily entangles. And thinking about this is an area that we don't necessarily talk quite so much about in our circles, but it's put here really quite strongly for us to think about, that this is something that can trip us up. And so there's these two things in the race. One's slowing down, but the other is quite a heartbreaking sight, isn't it? I don't know if you've ever been watching, say, a 5,000 meter race, and you see all of the athletes running along. And if somebody trips up and falls flat on their face in the middle of the race, your heart really goes out to them, doesn't it? You feel, oh, they're really struggling there. And I think that's really how we should react. And that's how we should react if somebody running the race with us trips up. We should be heartbroken about it. Just thinking about some of the things, different things will affect different people, but certainly one of the things that's very prevalent these days is pornography. Statistics that we hear show that for many years it's been a hidden thing that not many people have wanted to talk about, but something that is tripping many people up. So that was one thing that just sort of came to my mind as we're thinking about what is it that can cause us to fall flat on our face. Another one is talking about other people. It's not helpful when you're in a race to start looking around at other people and concentrating on them and what they're doing and so on. Definitely, if you're looking around at someone behind you, you can end up flat in your face. It's a good way to lose your footing, isn't it? But the Bible does talk quite seriously about gossiping. And then in other places talks about it in even more stark terms, about backbiting or devouring one another. But let's just think about that. We're encouraged not to be gossiping. Thinking about this, another verse, Proverbs 29, this really speaks to this one. It says, a man who flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. By transgression, a man is snared, but the righteous sings and rejoices. And I think this speaks to the fact of pride being a snare for a lot of us. Sometimes the more progress we make, the more pride is a snare, because we can start to think we're doing well. And it says the man that flatters somebody else, it's like spreading the net, that his feet get caught up in it and then bang, flat on the face. And the answer, it seems to say in here, is that the righteous sing and rejoice. Even if a snare is laid, if you sing and rejoice, if you like, you're looking not to yourself and taking the flattery on board, but you're singing, your heart is out to the Lord. And that's the best way not to get proud. It's to consider him. How do we handle it if someone's falling flat on their face? James says, confess your sins to each other. And so part of the onus is on us, especially if it's a hidden sin that's not so obvious to others. It might be not so clear that we've fallen flat on our face. It encourages us to come to each other and that we should pray for each other. It says, pray for each other that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous man is powerful and effective. So if we have fallen flat on our face, I know in James this is talking about healing, but perhaps healing is actually not just physical healing of ailments that we've got, but healing in this sense. If we've fallen flat on our face, we need to be healed. We need to be set back up on our feet. And coming to a brother, possibly one of the elders, and the prayer of a righteous man is powerful and effective. A little bit further on, James says, my brothers, if one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring him back, remember this: whoever brings a sinner back from the error of his ways will save him from death and cover a multitude of sins. So that's wonderful, isn't it? That if we've fallen flat on our face, we don't need to just sit there licking our wounds for ages. We can be put back on our feet. It can take the help of someone else. And however heartbreaking a runner falling might be, if you see that runner in a 5,000 meter race, there was one very good example of it quite some time ago. When they get back up on their feet again and they start running, then it's inspiring to everybody. And often the cameras turn away from the ones who are leading the race, and they're focusing on the one who's managed to get up again and is back on his way and he's going. And two images stick with me. One is of a chap who got really quite injured in a fall. And I think it might have been one of his relatives came on and helped him all the way to the end. And it took ages to get there. And he was a long, long time after everybody else had finished, but he made it to the end. And there's also that image of the Brownlee brothers. I think it might have been Alistair Brownlee who turned back and just helped his brother over the line. And they're just encouragements to us to consider each other and to help each other. And far from the focus being on the fall, the getting up and going on is something that is just so wonderfully inspiring, that let's just take heart from that and get on ensuring that we go to one another and confess our sins, receive the help, and inspire others. And then the third thing I thought about, not so much here in Hebrews 12, but the thought about going down a wrong track. So we can be slowed down, we can trip up, or we can feel like we're still making progress, but we're actually going down a wrong track. Galatians sort of pinpoints this, doesn't it? In Galatians, Paul says, you were running a good race. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? And he says, stand firm. Don't let yourself be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. He was talking here to a group of people who were being pulled back from the freedom that they had and that were to move on in, and were being brought back to a life, Old Testament life, of the law. And it's, as I was thinking about speaking, I had a quick look at Pilgrim's Progress, which is obviously very relevant in this whole area. It's very interesting to read the names of all the people that Pilgrim came across, and to consider that. But in fact, this was just before he came to the cross. He was diverted and he went to the village of morality by a man called Legality. And when he got to the village there was no crime there. People were living very godly lives. It seemed like a good place to be, until he then got brought up sharp by the evangelist, who asked him what he was doing there and put him back on track. And it is, sometimes it's not just appealing, it's sort of almost seems the right thing to do, if I can put it that way, to focus on the law to get things right. But God has put us into a new way, and we're to run the race according to the rules that he's given us, and we're to run free. So I just want to encourage you that that's how we're to run our race. Now, getting towards the end, Hebrews 13 also gives some practical instructions. And I was very interested as I looked into Hebrews 13 at what the practical instructions were. And as you look through Hebrews 13, there are three things he says. He says, don't forget. He says, remember. And he says, keep. And they seem things that are very relevant when you're on a long journey. That as you're on a long journey, you can start to forget certain things. Perhaps it's the effort that you're putting in, and it's sort of getting at you, and you're starting to feel weary, and you can start to forget things. And in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2, he says, don't forget to entertain strangers. It's good to remain hospitable. And I was wondering about that especially in today's COVID restrictions, we can't necessarily always entertain strangers in the same way as we could. We can't be as openly hospitable, opening our doors to other people. And yet, we're to, even under the restrictions that we've got, remain open to other people, remain hospitable. It may be the telephone, it may be other ways that are our ways of remaining hospitable to people. The second thing in Hebrews 13, it says, do not forget, is do not forget to do good and to share with others, for with such sacrifices, God is pleased. So as we're running our race, let's not just start to forget things. So let's keep doing good. Let's keep sharing with others. Two things it says to remember. It says to remember those in prison. And it says also to remember your leaders. May not necessarily be the same, might be one and the same people. Obviously for Paul, towards the end of his life, it was true for him. In many countries, it is true that it's the leaders that are put in prison. Let's keep remembering. And then also it says, one of the practical instructions is to keep ourselves free from the love of money, one of the things that can trip us up. And it says to keep ourselves pure. So a number of things it tells us not to bear in mind in order to keep running well. And moving away from the writer of Hebrews to Peter, I just want to finish by reading Peter chapter 4, verses 7 to 10, because although it's a different author, as you read this, it almost sounds like he's saying exactly the same things condensed that Paul was saying in these verses. Peter chapter 4, verse 7 onwards says, "The end of all things is near. Therefore, be clear-minded and self-controlled so that you can pray. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each one of us should use whatever gift he has received to serve others faithfully, administering God's grace in its various forms." So I just want to leave you with that encouragement. Amen.